So let's dive into segment number one, and this is about closing the gap, and obviously this is a segment we always talk about, right? And this is something that is going to be a topic of conversation until Notre Dame has actually done so. And this was brought up today by a user on the Irish Breakdown board whose username is 12 Irish NC. So when a topic comes from somebody else, I want to give credit where credit is due, and he kind of brought it up today. And so there's a part of what he discussed about gap closing that I'll get into. And because I don't think it's quite as uh, I think there's a lot more depth to the conversation. And essentially, the comment was Notre Dame needs to start dominating big games to really make a difference. And if you dominate big games, then you close the recruiting gap. And my answer to that was simply, well, you've got to close the recruiting gap before you can win those big games, right? I mean, Vanderbilt's not going to go out there and start beating Alabama, LSU, and Georgia regularly, right? Because they don't have good enough players. So you've got to get your roster to a certain level where that can start to happen. And then when that happens, then you can start taking that next jump and start getting better and better players. And so, that's what we're going to talk about. And what we're not going to do, okay, so there's a particular fellow in the chat who knows who I'm talking about and looking at. We're not going to base this off of opinions of other people. We're going to actually talk about data, and we're going to talk about our opinion, because this is not a place where we just buy into the narrative blindly, okay? But this is also not a place where we're going to spin it and make you feel like it's sunshine and rainbows all the time about Notre Dame. So when you talk about closing the gap, it really comes down to where does Notre Dame have to get to as a program? And this is holistically on and off the field. Where does Notre Dame have to get to the point where they are a team that we look at regularly as a title contender? Now, that doesn't mean they're going to win it every year. That's never been the case. It's about where you look at every year, you kind of view Notre Dame as that team that to keep an eye on, right? Like right now, you think about every year for the last 10 years, Bama's going to be in that conversation when the season starts. Ohio State's usually in that conversation when the season starts. Clemson has for a long time been in that conversation. Not so much this year, but for a long time, they were in that conversation. You look at teams like that are coming on a lot more lately. Georgia's actually for the most part been along those lines for a long time, because there were some really good Mark Richt teams that were in that conversation. But that's where Notre Dame is trying to get to. There was a time in the 2000s where every year USC was that team. There was a time when Oklahoma was that team. Now people think that Texas is going to be that team. So what does Notre Dame have to do to be that team that every year you think of, that team's got a shot to make a run at a title and goes out and makes noise every year? So it's not like that team that's ranked in the top 10 every year and never finishes there like Texas A&M, but a team that actually ranks high. This was a beef that I had with Michigan for a long time. It seemed like every year under Jim Harbaugh, Michigan was getting all this preseason hype, and they never lived up to expectations. Well, guess what? Harbaugh built the program to the point where the last 3 years they've started to live up to that, where they have been a team that has gone on to make a lot of noise and be successful, including some years where I didn't actually think that they were going to be as good as they ended up being. So that's kind of where it gets to. And then at some point in time, you've got to win a title, right? I mean, you haven't really closed the gap until you've actually won a championship. But what closing the gap is not, in my opinion, is just winning a title and then going back to being mediocre. Like, to me, Auburn didn't close the gap in 2010. They had a magical season. What did they do after that? I think they went within 2 years, their head coach was fired, right? Because 2010, they played for the title. But in 2013, when they played and won the title, in the 2013, when they played for the title again, it was with a new football coach. Not because the old coach had left for a better job, because he'd gotten fired. So between 2010 and 2013, their coach had been fired. And then since that 2013 season, Auburn's had some years here and there, but they've never really been a team that you thought of, oh, gee, that team can win it. So there are teams that can have that sort of magical season. But what I'm referring to are teams that go out there on a regular basis and you look at and say, that team has a chance to win it, and then they back it up by, in Notre Dame's case, making deep runs into the playoffs. Like, to me, this is how it should look for me. This is what closing the gap looks like for me. In a 5-year period, Notre Dame should win a title once, play for a title once more, make it to a semifinal game one other time, and at least a quarterfinal in the other game, and honestly should be a playoff team every year. Honestly, you should look at it and say they should be in the quarterfinals twice semifinals once, championship game twice, you got to win one. I would be okay if there's that season where you're very young and you've got a tough schedule and you go 10-2, you don't make the playoff, you maybe go 9-3, you don't make the playoff, you're really young, you go to a New Year's Six game or a big bowl game and you have a big win, you finish 10-3, and then the next year you're right back on track. That's going to happen to most teams. The Alabama runs of never being down, that's hard to repeat. And it's hard for Notre Dame to repeat that as well. But in a 5-year stretch, that's kind of what I think the expectation should be for Notre Dame as far as where they can be as a program. And if anything beyond that, then obviously is gravy. But that's where I think Notre Dame should be if they have truly closed the gap. Is they're that kind of team. But every year in those 5 years, every year you look at them and say, that team's dangerous. That's a team to watch out for. So that's what closing the gap looks like. Now the question is how close is Notre Dame to that? And what work needs to be done to get to that point. So we're going to break this down into kind of a few different topics, like of where they're at. Number one is going to be where I believe Notre Dame has shown progress. There's two areas where I think Notre Dame has closed the gap, and we'll actually get into that in a later segment. But the first one is going to be progress. Where has Notre Dame showed progress? And then I'll get into kind of what are some of the areas where you need to maintain. Right, that'll be second because there are some areas where you've had some success there, and then some areas where I have questions or where there's work to do to continue closing the gap. Now, this isn't just going to be okay. We're going to go quarterback, running back, wide receiver. We will have some of that conversation, but as I said, this is holistic. So this is also as much about the institution, the football coaching staff, the support they get, the facilities, all those type of things factor into it, as well as where is your roster. End of the day, the roster is the primary driver, right? And do you have the resources in place from a coaching standpoint to drive that roster and get it to the point where you're getting the most out of it? So, but there are things that lead to that, right? And commitment to the program has got to be one of those things. If you are an institution that does not show support for your football program the way that Georgia does, the way that Alabama does, the way that Ohio State does, and then you're not going to be successful. And what I mean by support, I don't mean you have to match them dollar for dollar. I don't mean if they build a slide in their football facility, you've got to build a slide. If they build a swimming pool for their football players, you've got to build a swimming pool. That's not what I'm referring to. I'm talking about creating things, the best facilities possible, the best aspects possible for you to say, hey, we're getting the most out of our football program and we're maximizing our players' development on and off the field because of these resources. Having a really cool arcade in your players' lounge is not going to close the gap. It might be something that players like and it makes them comfortable, but you're not beating Georgia because you had, Pac-Man and Galaga in your players' lounge, right? It's the other aspects. Do you have a top-notch training facility? Do you have a top-notch strength conditioning program? Do you have a top-notch nutrition program and all the things that includes? Are you maximizing your ability to have a top coaching staff? Are you doing all those type of things to make sure that the infrastructure is in place to be there? And here's the thing. 2 years ago, I would have said the Notre Dame as an institution has a lot of work to do in order to show the kind of true commitment needed for them to get to this point. But as you evaluate where they're at, I think that is now an area where we've seen major progress, especially over the last year. The last year has really shooken things up in this regard because you've seen some major changes. Now, part of commitment is money. Let's be honest about that. It's not just about throwing money at the program and saying, we're spending X amount of dollars, but say, are we willing to spend the money on these very important aspects that are needed for the football program to go out and be the best that it can be? And when you look at Notre Dame, what's something that for those of you that have been following me for a while or have listened to me for a while or read my writings for a while and you go back to the beginning, you know that I've been very hard on the Notre Dame administration for its lack of support for the football program. I'll praise them in some of the areas where they've done well, but there's just too many areas where they weren't showing enough support. And that included the head football coach not doing enough at those times as well. Well, when you look at the last year, and really the last several years, when you talk about the indoor facility, that really kind of kicked things off. Like the stadium upgrades were cool and they were nice and I liked all those type of things. But they're just not really things that I look at and say, okay, yeah, that's cool. That helps with recruiting. That's helped with aesthetics, but you're not winning football games because you did the Crossroads project. I don't believe that has any impact on winning football games. it's good. It's not a negative, but it's not something that all of a sudden you're going to go beat this team because of this environment. People complain about, oh, Notre Dame doesn't have a very loud environment. And I would say, well, there's some reasons why that's true, and some of those are outside the football program's control. But I've been at some games in the last 10 years that were very, very loud. Why? Big time opponent. Notre Dame played big time football. I mean, the beginning of for those of you who are there, you can attest to this. The first quarter of the USC game this year was incredibly loud because it was a big time game, night game, two top 10 teams, undefeated USC, one lost Notre Dame, or two lost Notre Dame coming off of a loss, two ranked opponents, not two top 10 teams, but two ranked opponents. Notre Dame is scrambling. They've lost 2 of 3. They're fighting for their lives. Top 10 team, undefeated team, rival comes into town, reigning Heisman Trophy winner, kicked your butt a year ago in the Coliseum, and Notre Dame came out, jumped all over them, and the place was going crazy. Right. I remember being at the Texas game in 2015, and they were just starting kind of the renovations for the Crossroad Project. And Malik comes out early, and I can't remember, like they took one drive down the field and scored, and then Malik hits a bomb to Will Fuller, and the place is just going crazy. Jalen Smith has some big time plays, and the place was really loud. If you want to have a louder crowd, put a better product on the field. That's step number one. Now, there's other things they can do to try to limit selling tickets and all that, but the product has really got to be there. The commitment that to me matters is more so what you're doing for the day-to-day stuff for the football program. The indoor facility was big, in my opinion. That was step one. And now you've got the renovations to the Goog. I've been told it's between $1 and $200 million. What I'm told is the total cost is going to be much, much closer to $200 million. That's a huge investment that you're making. Brand new facility, state-of-the-art inside stuff. I mean, state-of-the-art strength programs. Right? They're going to have a place to prepare food for players and places to eat for student athletes and all that kind of stuff. A lot of cool stuff happening there. That is far more practical to helping your football team be successful. It's not just about having a cool new building. It's about a building that's going to make it better for football players. There's some things I've heard that are going to be part of it that I don't want to mention because I don't know if that's for sure. There's a lot of rumors about these type of things, and so I'm not going to speak on certain things that I'm not 100% certain of that are going to be in there. But if the things that I'm hearing are going to be in there, you're looking at it saying, hey, this is big. This is impactful. This is important. This is going to make the football players have a better chance of being at their peak week to week to week. That's impactful. That matters. And so the school is making a commitment to that. Well, why? Well, I think there's multiple reasons why. One is I've been told by a couple sources that I trust, one off campus, someone who's not at Notre Dame, and then someone that is at Notre Dame, that what you've seen in the last year, especially 6 to 8 months, is there has been a battle on campus for a long time. And the side of the people that believe that football success impacts overall success at Notre Dame are winning the conversation. And I don't know what turned the tide. I don't have a clue on that. I would love to find out someday. But that there's an understanding amongst leadership at Notre Dame now, whether it's new people, other people changing their views, that if you really want to maximize what the University of Notre Dame can be, financial power, academic power, all these things, the better your football team is, the more support and the more financial support, especially, that you're going to get. It creates a better environment on campus. These are just realities that there was leadership at Notre Dame a long time ago, and well, not even that long ago, that didn't quite understand this. They viewed the football team and the school as sort of like at odds, and you tolerate the football team because it made money. And there's other people that say, hey, look, we understand that if the football team is successful, that bleeds into everything else that we want to do. And so that's huge to hear that. And so that gets me a little bit fired up about the commitment as well. And then you're seeing them, it's one thing to say that, but then you see them putting the money towards it. What are some other things that we've seen the institution commit money to? Retaining coaches. There's coaches that had, I won't say who, but there was at least that I know of 2 assistant coaches on the current staff that had significant interest to go to other places for pretty substantial pay raises, and they turned them down immediately because Notre Dame had already stepped up and renegotiated their contract and paid them. That's never happened in my lifetime with an assistant coach that I know of. So, and I've been covering the team directly here, living here, covering it directly since 2010, and indirectly, covering it from the outside at other, for other places since 2007. I've never heard of Notre Dame go reaching out or not reaching out. The head coach is part of it, but like giving big pay raises to assistant coaches without there being interest from other people. That's big. That's big. And so you ask yourself, well, why are they doing this? Well, number one is what I stated. There's a greater commitment to we need this thing to be good as it can be. And that's huge. Getting that type of support on campus. And it's not because Jack Swarbrick's leaving and Pete Bavach was coming. I can assure you of that. Some of these things are things Jack Swarbrick's been fighting for quite some time that are now, he now has more support on campus. And now Pete Bavach was walking to a situation where a lot of the battles that Jack Swarbrick fought, now Pete Bavach comes in and your expectation is to take it to another level and build on the foundation that Jack Swarbrick laid. That's important because you have to get that support. But you also have had some things happen in the last year that have also given the institution more resources. And what I like is, and I try to run my business this way as best I can, but when you get a big revenue boost, there's one of two things you can do with it. One is you can just say, okay, I'm going to put in the bank and let it collect interest and, get ready to make sure that when I die, I have a lot of money that I can't take with me. Right. Or you can say, hey, I'm going to take some of this. I'm going to save it. I'm going to, put it over here and save it and be responsible. I'm going to take some of it and invest it over here in certain parts of, but then I'm going to take the other parts of it and I'm going to reinvest it into the thing that made this money in the first place to try to make it better, to try to make it even more profitable. And so and not because I believe that return on that investment is going to create a lot better, a lot more. I know, right? USMA collect interest nowadays. I'm with you, man. But generally speaking, so Notre Dame goes out and they get the new Under Armour deal, which adds revenue into the athletic department, into the football program. And then they sign the extension with NBC. That was the second big shoe to drop. Now, as I said before, we don't know particulars. I have been told it's over 50. I have been told it's closer to 60 than it is 50 by another source that I trust very much. When you look at the deal that they get, let's just say it's 50, just for the sake of argument. And we've talked about this before, so I'll be quick. You're getting minimum 15 to 18 from the ACC. You're getting now, let's just say 50 from NBC. You went from being about a $25 to $30 million per year TV revenue operation, and you were getting, I think it was a million or a couple $1 million from the college football playoff. You're looking at a situation where you were 30 to 35 at the most in TV revenue on a given year. Now you're talking about a situation where Notre Dame is going to be almost double that just on TV revenue with NBC and the ACC. Then on top of that, Notre Dame gets this new really nice deal as part of the college football playoff, where I believe the number, and I know some of you have actually figured this out, but I believe the number is somewhere around $13 million a year that they're going to get as part of the college football playoff. Now, here's the interesting thing about that. What some people are going to think is that's what they make when they get into the playoff. That's not accurate. If Notre Dame goes 4-8 next year, they get that number. That's the number they get. So now you're talking about potentially having Notre Dame being over $70 million now in revenue in TV and playoff revenue compared to 30 to 35 in previous years. That's a big jump. I mean, we're talking millions of dollars. It can kind of all seem a little bit, okay, it's millions or millions, but let's look at percentages. You're talking about doubling, right? You're talking about having a double, like your 100% growth. Is that what that would be, right? So you're making 35 and now you're making 70. I believe that would be 100% growth because 50% growth would be 15 of 30, correct? I believe that's accurate. But you've doubled your money just like that in 1 year. And so what you're seeing the school do is say, hey, look, obviously some of this money is going to be used for other aspects of campus, and that's what Notre Dame does, and that's what they should do. But a bigger chunk of that, from what I can see, is being reinvested into the Notre Dame football program. And to me, that is huge. And it's another thing that shows support. So when you want to talk about closing the gap, and you want to talk about resources and facilities and all that kind of stuff, that it has to start there, because at the end of the day, you could have great coaching staff, and Marcus Freeman could be the greatest coach ever to come to Notre Dame since Lou Holtz was here or Eric Parsegian was here, however far you want to go back. But if you don't get the support from the administration, there's going to be a cap on it, especially today. This is a whole different game than Eric Parsegian was the head coach of Notre Dame. Whole different game. You have to have that support. And from everything we can tell so far, Notre Dame is getting that. So that's number one, where they're showing progress. Number two is, I'm just going to put this holistically, coaching. Coaching is getting better. Has it closed the gap? No. Is it closing the gap? I think that's an absolute yes. Now, Marcus Freeman is still a bit of an unknown in this regard to, can he win the big games and things along those lines. But even with Marcus Freeman, we've seen growth in certain areas, which I'll get into here down below. But one of those things is the staff that he's put together. And that means several things. Number one is, when it comes to coaching, is obviously, do you have more support from the school to pay your coaches? Talked about that. The second part is, can you have good retention with your coaching staff? Talked about that. Notre Dame lost Chris O'Leary this offseason. They lost Chancey Stuckey this offseason. So one move, you decided to get rid of somebody. The other one is you lost somebody. And it was a great opportunity for Chris O'Leary. He did a really nice job at Notre Dame as a safeties coach. Recruiting was starting to come along, and that's a loss. You can't deny that that's a loss. But you kept the rest of your staff intact, and you had a great plan of succession for the defensive side of the ball once O'Leary left. I mean, I heard some names being floated around about the DB, but the thing that I heard from all my sources right away was like, no, they're going to just promote Max Bola, because that was a way to kind of give Mike Mickens more responsibility, which means bigger pay. Also take advantage of Mike Mickens' great talent as a developer and teacher. And then now Max Bola, you get to keep, because I don't know that Notre Dame has any chance of keeping Max Bola if they don't hire him as a full-time assistant, because he was getting a lot of attention from what I'm told. As an assistant coach. So this was big for Notre Dame. And then your offensive staff, obviously Jared Parker leaves. So that was the third loss, but you keep Dylan McCullough, which is huge. You keep Joe Rudolph. So there's finally going to be some continuity on the O-line that had 3 different coaches in 3 seasons. And you kind of, Gino Guidugli is the quarterback's coach. So he now goes into year 2. So there's going to be some level of continuity. Okay. Then you get into adding coaches. Okay, you're going to lose coaches. Bama loses coaches. Ohio State loses coaches. Georgia loses coaches. Everybody loses coaches. But what do you do about it when you lose them? Do you replace them with even better coaches? That's the key. And so when you look at the defensive side of the ball, I'm not going to make a case that Notre Dame did better, losing Chris O'Leary, because I think that would come across as disrespectful. I think Chris O'Leary did some very nice things in Notre Dame. But what I think they were able to do was make sure that it wasn't a step back. Now, is Max Bola going to be able to do for the linebackers what Chris O'Leary did for the safeties? That's a question mark. Is Mike Mickens going to be able to do for the entire secondary what he did for the cornerbacks? That's a question mark. I'm confident in those things, but it's still, you got to prove it, right? I mean, we can all be as confident as we want in Mike Mickens that he can do that, but it's not something he's done before. So we'll have to see it. But I think the plan was strong. Keep these guys in place. Let's have some continuity. Marty Biaggi knows these players. He can be involved. We'll have GAs involved. All that stuff looks good. Then offensively, you upgraded, pure upgrades. And you get rid of Chancey Stuckey. We don't need to rehash that disaster of the last 2 years. And you replace him with Mike Brown. Some questions about Mike Brown as a recruiter. It's early, and so that's why it's a question, because we don't know. But we do have a very strong track record as a position coach, and he's worked with your new offensive coordinator, Mike Denbrock. I like Jared Parker. I think Jared Parker had potential as an offensive coordinator. He did some good things this year. Notre Dame set a record in points, second best yards per play average since the end of World War II, behind only the 1 year from 2015 from Mike Denbrock. But there were also some flaws. There were some holes. There was some learning that needed to be done. There were some big game situations where we didn't see him do what he needed to do. Simple as that. You can like a guy all you want, and I like Jared Parker. Got to know him a little bit. Good dude. But the fact is you can look back and say, yeah, I like the guy. I think he has potential, but you didn't do a good enough job in this game. You made some coaching decisions that were not right in this game. You made some calls in that game that were just not right. You didn't have your team ready to play in this other game. There was too much of that. And you needed to have, in my opinion, a little bit more certainty. And with Mike Denbrock, you get more certainty. We know that Mike Denbrock can develop the different offense. With Jared Parker, if you didn't like Jared Parker, you never thought he was going to be good. If you did like Jared Parker, the conversation could only be, I think he can develop into a top coordinator. But he wasn't one. With Mike Denbrock, he is one. He is one. And so to me, I look at it and say, you went from a guy that maybe had some potential, but had a lot of learning to do, to a guy that is proven. He can win now. It's not a, well, can he? And it's not even, well, can Mike Denbrock put a top offense together at Notre Dame? We know he did it at Cincinnati. We know he did it at LSU. And my answer would be, yeah, because he did it at Notre Dame, 2015. That's exactly what happened in 2015, is he put a big-time offense on the field. And so that was a big upgrade. And it goes back to the first one. It was not cheap for Notre Dame to go get Mike Denbrock. You gave out Golden a big raise. I don't know what the particular numbers are from each position coach, but from if what I've been told by sources is true, you could probably count the number of teams that have higher paid coordinator tandem on one hand. It's probably where you're at. So you made an investment. So Notre Dame has shown, hey, we'll go get the best coaches. We'll do what we can to keep them as long as we possibly can. I think those are both great moves. So those are some of the off the field areas where I believe Notre Dame has closed the gap, and they're very important. They cannot be dismissed. If you don't have the success there, then there's a cap on how good you can be on the field, in my opinion, to a degree. And so that's where it's very good to see that Notre Dame has made some jumps in those areas. All right, let's get into the next part of areas where we've seen progress. And now this is going to be more player level. And number one, it begins at quarterback. Now, are there questions about, can the quarterback play turn into championship? Can the quarterback talent turn into championship production? That's still a question mark. I don't think anybody can. I don't care how big of a Riley Leonard supporter you are, and you all know that I think very highly of Riley Leonard. You have to be willing to say, but can he do it at Notre Dame? And that's a very fair thing to say. You can be as high as you want to be on Steve Angeli or Kenny Minchey or CJ Carr or Deuce Knight and say, I think that guy's capable of winning a championship here. And I think multiple of the guys I just mentioned are capable of doing that, but it hasn't been shown yet. So that's a part of it. But what you can say in the present, while admitting, yes, they need to show that they can play at this level, what you can't deny is that the talent in the quarterback room is as good as there is in college football, in my opinion. I'm going to do a top 10 list of quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, all that kind of stuff here this offseason. Vince and I are going to get into some of that this summer, getting into June and July as we get ready for the season. We're going to have some top 10 lists for college football. It's going to be a segment that we'll do throughout the offseason. And I may even do a couple on my own before we even get to June. Just depends on how fired up I am and how much research I can do. But what I can promise you this is that Notre Dame absolutely will be in the top 10. A year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, they weren't sniffing the top 10 when it came to the talent of their quarterback room. And so now you look at it and say, you landed talent, and you showed that you can go out there and get impact players in the portal. Notre Dame has gotten 3 Power 5 starting quarterbacks in the portal in the last, 5 years? Jack Cohn and then Sam Hartman and Riley Leonard now these last 2 years. So I think to win a championship at Notre Dame, you have to have big-time quarterback play. To have big-time quarterback play, you need to upgrade the talent of your quarterback room and create a wider margin for error, injuries, guys not panning out, and they've certainly done that. We broke down the quarterback room last week. We don't need to spend too much time on it. But to me, there's no doubt that from a talent standpoint, that Notre Dame is absolutely closing the gap. Now, how quickly as a team they can actually close that gap, and gaps closed, they went out and competed for and won a title, that's going to be determined by how well this talent, how much production you can get from the talent, right? It's that potential versus production thing that I always talk about. The potential is as high as it's been since probably maybe 2014 even, but even then I still, as much as I love Everett Golson's talent, I was concerned about the fact he'd missed the previous year and those type of things, but the talent was enormous. I would even argue this talent is better. And the excellent talent. Now it's about getting the production that matches the talent. That remains to be seen. I'm going to stay on offense for this next group. I don't think there's any doubt that Notre Dame has closed the gap at running back. And to the point where, you're talking about having a running back that was one of I think the 5 best running backs in college football last year. The numbers certainly back that up for Audric Estime. You're talking about a team that isn't now relying on just one guy to carry the day. You're talking about a team that's now got depth of talent. So, you can lose a guy like Audric Estime and you're like, okay, they're going to be fine because you're replacing him with a lot of talent. And it's not better Jeremiah Love better be good or they're going to be in trouble. And it's not, Jadarian Price better be good or they're in trouble. It's Jeremiah Love, Jadarian Price, Jabron Payne, Kedron Young, Aeneas Williams. There's the depth there now. And they don't appear to be slowing down at all when it comes to this. So you're able to recruit top players again because you hired coaches that are good teachers and recruiters. And so I'm a big fan of all that kind of stuff. And so to me, this is a big one because this is one of those positions where you'd hear for a while that people would say, well, Notre Dame can't really recruit top players at that position. Well, they have, and they'll continue to do so. Now, where do they rank in the top 5, top 10? That I don't know yet. I've got to go look at some of the rooms. There are other teams like Ohio State and Penn State that I will rank ahead of Notre Dame's room right now because they have more proven talent. Would I trade Ohio State's room for Notre Dame's room on just God-given talent? Excuse me. I said they have more talent. They have more proven production than Notre Dame's group. Top to bottom, 1 to 5. Would I trade their depth chart for Notre Dame's depth chart? No, I wouldn't. If we're just talking talent, potential, upside, athleticism, all that. Ohio State's room, however, has got 2,000-yard running backs in it, and Notre Dame's running backs, I don't think, have rushed for 1,000 yards combined. If you're being honest, you have to give a big part of the evaluation to the proven production. Same thing with Penn State. They've got 2 running backs that are proven. So where does Notre Dame fit in that? We'll see. I'm going to crunch the numbers, do some analysis, and we'll have that this summer. But what I can confidently tell you is I'll be shocked if they're not in the top 10, and I'll be a little surprised if they're not sniffing the top 5 or inside the top 5, just because it's going to be based on our rank is going to be based on, depth, proven production, talent, versatility, all fit in the offense, all those type of things. They'll be a top 10 unit, and I think they could be in the conversation for top 5, and we'll see exactly where they fall. But the depth is important, and you've got game breakers now. You've got multiple game breakers now, not just one guy who's really fast, and if you can find a way to get him free, you're going to be all right. You've got multiple home run hitters at running back now for Notre Dame. You've got versatility at running back for Notre Dame. You don't just have one type of runner. You have multiple types of runners, which means you can go at teams a lot differently. And that's an offensive coordinator's dream, is to not only have talent at running back, but have running back talent that I can use in different ways and at times used together. Makes life very, very difficult on defensive coordinators. A couple areas where I also think Notre Dame is closing the gap. And this one is obvious for us. We'll go to the defensive side of the ball, and that's secondary. Now, for a while there, it was just corner. And since Mike Mickens has arrived, Notre Dame has very much been closing the gap. And the last 3 years, really, they've kicked the door down. And now they're not like, to me, when I look at Notre Dame, you guys tell me in the chat if you agree with this. I think we're going to mostly be on the same page. The last 2 years, Notre Dame's cornerback room has been top 10 in the country, minimum, both years. This past year, I would argue they were top 5. And I would argue that vehemently. Like, you better show me something. There's maybe a couple rooms that you could say were better or as good. You could argue Alabama's was better or as good. There's a couple that you could look at. But there's no way you're telling me this is not a top 3 to 5 cornerback tandem last year with Benjamin Morrison and Cam Hart. They were outstanding. The numbers back it up. I mean, look at Notre Dame's secondary. Look at Notre Dame's pass defense last season. Despite the fact they were blowing teams out and had big leads and teams kind of had to throw, when you look at where Notre Dame ranked last year in pass defense, they were an elite defense. They ranked 3rd last year in passing yards allowed per game. They ranked 3rd last year in yards allowed per pass attempt. They tied with Michigan for 1st in fewest touchdown passes allowed. They had twice as many interceptions as they had touchdown passes allowed. They ranked number 1 in college football last year in lowest pass efficiency rating, and they ranked number 2 last year in college football in lowest completion percentage allowed. There's literally not a statistic when it comes to yards, when it comes to defensive pass game production, that you look at and say they weren't elite in that category, top 5. And then you say, well, okay, I've used this argument for Michigan, for example, where I say, yeah, Michigan had a great pass defense, but one thing that helped them is they didn't play a lot of teams that were really good at throwing the football. Well, when you look at Notre Dame, you can't really argue that. You can't look at Notre Dame and say, hey, they didn't play anybody that was good throwing the football. I mean, they played several teams that were good throwing the football. They played the best receiver in college football last year, who pretty good room, and held them in check, held them to one of their lowest production performances of the season. In 2 years, they kept Marvin Harrison under 100 yards. I don't mean 100 yards per game. I mean, they had in 2 games against Notre Dame, Marvin Harrison had less than 100 yards receiving. That's really good. They played against Riley Leonard last year. They played against the Louisville offense last year. Running the game, not as great. Stopping the pass, pretty good last season. They played against Caleb Williams in USC. So they played some teams that could throw the football. In 2022, Notre Dame was also still a pretty good pass defense in 2022, and ranked in the top 15 to 20 in a lot of different categories, despite playing against what I would call a very challenging schedule that year when it comes to Drake May, C.J. Stroud, Caleb Williams, Jaron Hall, Tanner McKee, Spencer Rattler, a lot of guys that just got drafted at quarterback Notre Dame has played against the last couple of years. So you've seen them do it against teams that can throw the football or that have talent. And then this year was great, as we saw them lose Benjamin Morrison for a game, and then Cam Hart gets hurt, I think in the first quarter against Pitt, and Christian Gray and Jaden Mickey step onto the field and just do the same exact thing. And that's where you start kind of getting excited, where like if Notre Dame loses Benjamin Morrison, let's say he doesn't play next year, just for argument's sake, does Notre Dame have a top 5 cornerback room? Nope. No, they don't. You can't argue that, because there's a lot of, there's talent, but it's unproven. Would I still argue that Notre Dame has a top 10 quarterback room if they lose Benjamin Morrison and he doesn't play in 2024? I would say yes. There's a lot of teams on Notre Dame's schedule, a lot, that would say, yeah, I'll take Jaden Mickey and Christian Gray as my starting corners. Absolutely. Yeah, I'll take you could give me your depth chart minus Benjamin Morrison, and we'll take that in a heartbeat. A lot of teams on Notre Dame's schedule would do that. A lot of teams ranked in the top 25 would be willing to do that. So it's not just that they kind of got lucky with that 1-2 punch of Cam Hart, who moved from receiver. You didn't even recruit him as a DB. You went and found the sleeper from Arizona that nobody had ever heard of, which is not true. I mean, Alabama wanted him. Jimmy Lake wanted him. Marcus Freeman and Mike Mickens wanted him. But the recruiting services didn't want him. He wasn't a top 300 recruit by anybody. One of the services had him ranked as a 3-star. And he comes out and he's one of the 5 best corners in college football. Well, okay, that's pretty good. You got lucky, you could argue. You hit that one magical home run like you did with Will Fuller, where you got a guy that nobody thought was going to be that dynamic player, and he turned out to be that dynamic player. That would be fair if that was the case. But you followed it up with Christian Gray and Micah Bell. Now, Micah Bell has since transferred because he was struggling to get on the field. Christian Gray, top 100 recruit. You beat LSU. You beat Ohio State for him. You go out the next year, you get Carson Hobbs and Leonard Moore. I'm very high on Leonard Moore. Then you go out the next year, and you get Creed Thomas to kick things off, and then you land Dallas Golden, who's a big-time player, and they're on the verge of potentially getting another big-time cornerback pickup here soon as well. So it's not just that you had that one great year, and now you're riding that, but Notre Dame is putting itself in position to continue this trend year after year after year after year, and they're doing it the right way. When there's a highly ranked guy that's a big-time player, that's a top 100 guy, that fits what they're trying to do, like a Christian Gray, like a Dallas Golden, then they go get that guy. But they're not just beholden to the rankings. They're also saying, hey, look, I don't care what you say about Leonard Moore or Benjamin Morrison. We evaluate him as a certain way, and we're going to take him no matter what you think about him. And I think that part is important as well. So you have the evaluation, but you also have the coach there that can develop it. And it just goes to show how important it is. Yes, recruiting matters. There's no doubt. But if the development doesn't match to what, like Irish Gordy not saying, scouting, recruiting, development, I think you nailed it. You have to be able to scout well. then you have to recruit and land those players. And then you've got to develop it. If you don't have one of those three things, you're not going to maximize your potential as a program. So IGK, that's a great point you just made. And Mike Mickens, his comment was Mickens is the complete package. And I completely agree. Evaluation is great, recruiting is great, and the development is great. And that's going to allow you to succeed at a position for a long time that most Notre Dame fans felt like just be good enough. And you had that, you had the occasional great years. You think of like the 02 with Vontaze Duff and Shane Walton. You kind of you look at the 2000, what would it be, the 2000 10 unit was pretty good with Darren Walls and Robert Blanton and Gary Gray, and then you had the 2015 duo of Kavari Russell and Cole Luke, which were very good, ruined a bit by Brian Van Gorder, but very good. You had the 2018 tandem of Julian Love and Troy Pride, which was excellent. But then there was always like the year before, the year after, or somewhere around there, it just wasn't as good. Now you're talking about you're stringing it together. You're not putting those things together. And to me, I think that's a position where you've said, okay, you went from it being a major question mark. I mean, think about this, folks. In 2020, 5 seasons ago now, so 4 seasons before this, 2021, 22, 23. So 4 seasons before this year, Notre Dame went into the college football playoff against Alabama with Nick McLeod, an undrafted free agent, and Clarence Lewis as your starting corners. Now, I like Nick McLeod, and he did great things for Notre Dame that year. If he doesn't come to Notre Dame, they're probably not a playoff team. I truly believe that. He was that important to add because after him was very scary. If he doesn't come, you're in trouble at cornerback. And then you have Clarence Lewis as a true freshman. That was your starting cornerback group going into play Alabama, and Devontae Smith and John Mechie in that group. Mac Jones, a quarterback, Najee Harris. Fast forward just 4 seasons, and we're now sitting here in 2023, 3 seasons after that. And you're talking about Clarence Lewis, who was a starter on your last playoff team, can't get on the field at cornerback outside. Saw his numbers just dwindle his 4 years to the point where now he's transferring. And I'm happy for Clarence. I think Syracuse was a great fit for him. I'm happy for him, and I think that's going to work out well for him. And this isn't a knock on Clarence, but the reality is that's not a guy that you're going to have as a starting cornerback on a team that competes for a championship. And he went from being the starter on a team trying to win a championship to a player that basically was going to have a hard time getting on the field. That's how you turn a roster around. And that's exactly what Mike Mickens has done. And it's a position where a lot of us didn't feel like, I'll be honest, that's the one position I've argued for years. Oh, don't give me this. Notre Dame can't get kids here, can't get kids there. There's really 2 positions that I felt are going to be a struggle for Notre Dame to recruit with any consistency. I felt corner was one, and big Southern defensive tackles was another. They're like the really big kids because they, for whatever reason, they just don't want to go away from home. They just don't. Cornerback, you've answered that. Big Southern defensive tackles, you haven't been able to get those guys yet. You've almost got a couple here and there. Kid from North Carolina last year, but you haven't been able to land those guys. That's the last kind of remaining question mark. But cornerback, Notre Dame has shown that we can develop corners and that we can recruit corners and we can identify corners. And that's huge for Notre Dame to have done that. And then also what I think Notre Dame has closed the gap, and the gap is closed enormously at corner. Another position where the gap is closing quite a bit is linebacker depth. Now, the reason I don't say linebacker period is because when you're a team that in the last 12 years has produced 3 Butkus Award winners, you don't have a problem landing top linebackers. You're a team that also, on top of those 3 Butkus Award winners, also produced Drew Tranquil, a linebacker who's a starter in the NFL, has won a Super Bowl, has been a very good player, was a great player at Notre Dame, very good player in the NFL. You can produce linebackers. There's no question about that. You just had 2 linebackers get drafted this past year in the 3rd and 5th round. But it's one thing to have a talented guy that gets drafted and have the kind of depth of talent needed to say that you have one of the best rooms in the country. Now, does Notre Dame have one of the 5 best linebacker rooms in the country this year? No. Because if you're going to take all the things into consideration, there's a lot of unprovenness to this linebacker room. Have they closed the gap in a big way in regard to recruiting talent at linebacker consistently? Absolutely. And the reason that matters, here's why this matters and why I'm talking about it specifically. because just landing one top linebacker is good, but it's limiting. And here's what I mean by that. If Notre Dame hadn't recruited depth at linebacker, could they have been able to move Josh Burnham to end? Could they have afforded to move Junior Talamaka to end? Now, I would argue that they shouldn't have moved Junior. They should have left him a linebacker. But Josh Burnham's got a chance to be a very good edge rusher. But if you don't recruit that position effectively and know that, hey, yeah, we love Josh and we like his future at linebacker, but we've got Drake Bowen coming down the pike. We've got Preston Zenner committed. You know, we've got Jalen Seed on the roster. We've got these other players. We got Jaden Osbury committed. We've got these other guys coming down the pike. We can move Josh. And that afforded them the ability to move Josh. And you could do the same thing. There's a lot of different things that you can do as a football program when you recruit depth. And what they've done is they've been able to use linebacker depth to then plug holes at other positions. Because, like, where would the defensive end depth chart be right now for whatever your feelings are of Junior Tuihalamaka or Josh Burnham? Where would the depth chart be right now if they weren't on it at defensive end? It'd be very thin, very thin. So depth at linebacker is huge. They're the nickel position for 2024 is a bit of a question mark. You've got Jordan Clark, and then after that, I don't really know what you have. The two nickels coming into the offseason were Clarence Lewis and Micah Bell. Well, they've both transferred out. Part of the reason is because of the emergence of Jaden Osbury, who's a very unique athlete. So they're using him as sort of a hybrid player. I think he called it the Aztec on certain groups, but then he's playing basically a nickel type of position where, yes, he's going to rush and he's going to be a perimeter support player and he's going to do all those type of things that a linebacker does, but they're going to ask him to cover in ways you don't normally ask a linebacker to do. Well, so you were able to tap into the linebacker depth chart to fill a need over here, and that's important, and they've certainly closed the gap. Now, proven production has to get better. Impact talent that is on the field has to get better. And so there's still room to grow, but that's an area where they have to get better. And Adam Dowling, just real quick in the chat, there's a reason why Notre Dame didn't go after that player that you mentioned who was right down the street. And it wasn't because he didn't have good film. But you can't recruit everybody. I understand where you're coming from, and there's some Northern kids they got to get, and we'll get into that. But there's a reason that guy didn't come to Notre Dame. So linebacker depth is an important one. So a couple areas where Notre Dame's got to maintain, right? Close the gap in some areas, but what you can't do, and this is what happens to some teams, what you can't do is close the gap in one area and then fade in another. 2012, 2011, 2010, I felt that Notre Dame was in a position where their defense was good enough to win a lot of football games that they didn't win because the offense wasn't good enough. And then all of a sudden the offense gets really good in 2015, early 2014, and then all of a sudden the defense falters. And it's always been this like back and forth where when the offense is really good, the defense is falters. Run game is really good, the pass game stinks. The pass game is really good, the run game falters. They've never been able to put it all together. And part of that is because there was just the inconsistency at certain positions. You'd be really good here one year and then not the next. So there are areas where Notre Dame is the gap setter, in my opinion, or at least in that top group already. They've got to maintain offensive line, tight end. And both right now, I'm confident in. I like where Notre Dame is at. Offensive line, there's still some questions that Joe Rudolph has to answer from a coaching standpoint. Is he a championship caliber coach? We'll find out. I don't know the answer to that yet. The other question I had about him was, can he recruit to the level you need to recruit to at Notre Dame to build an elite line? It's nice to go get the projects and the under recruited players. You're going to find the Joe Waltz every now and then. That was a great evaluation by Jeff Quinn and the staff. But you can't rely on only those type of guys, right? You need to be able to go out and get top talent. I don't care where it's ranked. I just mean top talent. We all knew Ronnie Stanley was a top talent, even though he wasn't ranked in anybody's top 100. What I'm referring to is, can you beat teams for the top talent? Since he's been here, he landed Styles Prescott, Peter Jones, who were guys that Harry had done most of the legwork with, goes out and finds Anthony Knapp, and then does a great job landing Gerby Lambert. Now, Coach Easton laid the foundation, but it was not going to be easy to get him when other schools started getting involved, like Ohio State, some Penn State programs like that. Joe Rudolph got it done. Then you come into his second full cycle, and he goes out and gets Will Black, who's ranked as a top 250 player in my book, Rival On Three has him as a 5-star. I have him as more top 250 to 200 to 250 with a lot of upside. Same with Owen Striegebig, top 100 to 150 guy with a lot of upside. Matty Augustine, top 250-ish guy with a lot of upside. But the fits that you're looking for, right? Because you're recruiting for talent, and the talent is there. And then you look at 2026, and they're already in on some good players. So I like the direction that Joe Rudolph is taking things from a recruiting standpoint. He's building on some things Coach Easton did. A lot of tackle bodies. So that way, if you have to move guys to guard, you've got a lot of athleticism there. You've got length there. So I like what he's doing there. So the recruiting part, I'm not worried about. Now it's about go show that you can coach at a championship level. So that there's a need to maintain there. But I think that they're on a track there. And then tight end, I see no reason to believe that they're going to take a step back there. They had very good tight end play last year. They project to have very good tight end play in 2024. You've got Cooper Flanagan will be back in 25. You think that Eli Raridan will have a shot to be back in 25. Jack Larson's already showing some progress. You got James Flanagan committed in the 25 class, who's very, very good. Top 100 guy on my board. And then they're already after some really talented players in 2026. Those two positions, I believe, Notre Dame they've already closed the gap, and now it's just about maintain. And if you want to build on it, great. But, sometimes when you're already the best, I don't know that there's building to be done. You just got to make sure that nobody catches you. And that's what they're working on in those two positions, in my view.